Instead of a portfolio project, I opted to do a leadership case study looking at the development of leadership of the unique 1943 Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Through the lens of leadership frameworks we covered in this course and some new frameworks I researched that help describe the evolution of these extraordinary resistance leaders, I set out to describe a continuum of leadership frameworks to apply to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising context. This is a story of the evolution of ideological youth engaged in social engagement and nation building, thrust unwittingly and horrifyingly into a fight for their lives and those of their families and community. These young community leaders ultimately mounted the first organized resistance in Europe to the Nazis and forever impacted the collective conscience of their people. To set the stage, I'd like to first take a moment to review the history of Jews in Warsaw. Between World War I and the mid-1930s, 370,000 Jews lived in Warsaw, representing 1/3 of the city's total population. The Jewish community of Warsaw was the second largest in the world, second only to that of New York City. This Jewish population was mainly concentrated in a just under 3.5 square kilometer neighborhood of Warsaw, later to be known as the Warsaw Ghetto. In November 1940, the ghetto was sealed by the Nazis, and with all Jews from Warsaw and neighboring cities ordered into the sealed ghetto, the population increased to about 500,000. Even though many lived in poverty, until the ghetto was sealed and provisions cut off, the Warsaw Jews lived a vibrant, cultured life, including Yiddish theater, libraries, private education, shop and business ownership, and maintained a system of social welfare assistance. Between World War I and World War II, many Jewish youth movements developed from emerging ideologies, some religious, many socialist Zionist, and some with cultural, social, or political foci. As active anti-Semitism began a marked rise through the 1930s, and anti-Semitic laws were enacted, including exclusion from education and the outlawing of youth movements, the young leaders of these groups saw the writing on the wall, and in addition to continuing to advocate for Jews to leave Eastern Europe, preferably for Aliyah, a return to a Jewish homeland in Palestine, turned their attention to survival. One of these emerging leaders was Mordechai Anielewitz, who began his leadership journey as the head of the secular socialist Zionist Hashomer Hatzair, the Young Guard. Anielewitz later became a central leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in the Jewish Fighting Organization, known by its Polish acronym, the ZOB. The ZOB had a political focus and an alignment with the Polish resistance. Similar in ideology to the Hashomer Hatzair youth movement of the pre-war years was the Dror, or Freedom movement, led by Yitzchak Zuckerman, who also emerged in a leadership role in the ZOB during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Beitar was the youth wing of the Zionist revisionist political movement, led by Powell Frankel, who later took on the leadership of the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance Jewish Military Union, known by its Polish acronym, the ZZW. The ZZW had a military focus and included former Jewish Polish army officers. Now, to complete the background, we need to just take a quick review of the Warsaw Ghetto timeline to understand the circumstances in which this resistance leadership formed. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland and the bombing of Warsaw began. By January 1940, Jews were forbidden from public places, soon followed by the confiscation of all assets of Jews by the Germans. On October 16, 1940, all Jewish residents of Warsaw and neighboring towns and cities were ordered into the ghetto area, and 140,000 Poles were directed to move out. Food and medical supplies were rationed in amounts that were intentionally inadequate for subsistence. A month later, 11 miles of wall topped with barbed wire were built 10 to 12 feet high to entrap the Jews in the ghetto, and movement between the Aryan side of Warsaw and the ghetto was cut off. From January to March 1941, 5,000 to 6,000 ghetto inhabitants died each month from starvation and disease. During that time, Jews began hearing of mass murder campaigns in the Ukraine, in Kiev and Odessa. And on December 11, 1941, America declared war on Germany. 1 month later, with America in the war, news of organized concentration camps started to reach Warsaw and talk of resistance began. 6 months later, the first mass deportation of Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to the Treblinka death camp was conducted. In response, the first organized resistance organization, the ZOB, was formally established, calling for Jews to resist deportation and establish contact with Polish resistance forces. Between July and September 1942, at least 300,000 Jews were deported from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka. On January 18, 1943, an additional deportation of 8,000 Jews was ordered, and for the first time the resistance fought back. Catching the Nazis by surprise, the deportation was temporarily suspended. But on April 19, 1943, the Nazis re-entered the ghetto to resume deportations, and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising revolt formally began. Armed with a few pistols, grenades, firebombs, and little training, Jewish resistance fighters fought back on the streets and from rooftops and attics of surrounding houses. The resistance continued for 28 days, during which time the Germans ceased hand-to-hand battle in favor of setting fire to the ghetto block by block to burn out survivors. On May 16th, when there was nothing left of the ghetto but rubble, the resistance had reached its limit.
The Jews here did something no other Jewish community had done. They all agreed to band together and fight the Nazis to the death. Unfortunately, death was a near certainty for them. They had few weapons to combat the powerful German army, yet they were determined. For 4 years, they had been trapped in the walled Warsaw Ghetto, while the Nazis were either starving them to death or carting them to concentration camps and murdering them there. In 1943, the remaining Jews in this ravaged community shocked the Nazis and occupied them in battle for almost a month. Finally, to defeat these courageous Jews, the Nazis gave up hand-to-hand fighting and burned the ghetto down. Miraculously, some Jews survived, including this proud group of ghetto fighters. Recently, on the 75th anniversary of the uprising, the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto were honored.
What these brave young fighters did not know, and what they could not know, is the effect their actions would have on future generations of young Jews and all free people throughout the world.
The early years of youth movement group building align fairly well with Gil Furman's social justice leadership framework, in which Furman describes 5 levels of reflective and active actions. The first level, personal reflection, is evident in the early youth movements as the young leaders intentionally find their place and develop and find common ground in many of their ideologies. As times moved toward a more crisis orientation, though, the reflection likely changed from ideological to pragmatic, and their intentions from aspirational to survival. Furman's next 2 levels of action include interpersonal and communal relationship building. While there was evidence of cross-cultural collaboration in the early youth movements, with largely common goals, communal relationship building began to disintegrate as the resistance movements began to develop. There's little evidence of collaboration between the ZOB and ZZW resistance groups until the active days of the uprising itself. It remains unclear in all reports and literature as to why that happened, particularly since much of their activity overlapped, even if their ideological methodology did not. And the transformative nature of Furman's framework, at least in the context of systemic transformation, though central to the pre-war years, breaks away completely in the context of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. As the leadership moved toward resistance, systemic transformation was not the goal, nor a realistic component of the leadership structure. The stated goal of the resistance was not to survive the Germans, as they knew that was an impossibility, but was to embed forever in the Jewish consciousness that a resistance was mounted and the Jews did not go like sheep to slaughter, but in the end fought back with all they had. That awareness of social justice in the broadest possible context certainly typifies Furman's ecological dimension of social justice leadership. As the leadership moved towards establishing resistance, Furman's social justice framework has less applicability, and a new framework for leading in extreme contexts begins to emerge. Sean Hanna et al. Describe these 3 attributes of an extreme context, all of which are very evident within the Warsaw Ghetto situation. 1. The situation has the potential for massive physical, psychological, or material consequences that occur in physical or psychosocial proximity to organization members. 2. The consequences of the context are thought unbearable by organization members. And 3. Are such that they may exceed the organization's capacity to prevent those extreme events from actually taking place. In addition to describing characteristics of extreme contexts, Hanna et al. Delineate 4 types of extreme context organizations. The first 3 do not apply to the Warsaw Ghetto context. Trauma organizations, in which leaders and followers themselves are not at risk, for example in emergency rooms. Critical action organizations, in which leaders and followers are often at personal risk, but have the luxury of planning and resource building, for example traditional military combat units. And high reliability organizations, in which there is a lesser probability of trauma than with critical action organizations, and leaders and followers are not at high personal risk, for example emergency responders. Hanna et al.'s 4th type of extreme context organization, the naive organization, is a good fit with the reality of the Warsaw Ghetto, described as an organization that is thrust into extreme contexts by chance, lacks or has minimal training and resources, and is an organization in which the usual leader-follower constructs may not extend to the extreme context. As the resistance movement transitions from planning to active revolt, a 3rd leadership framework comes into play, well described by Ravindra Bengari's Grassroots Military Leadership Framework. In his paper, Bengari intentionally sets out to further Hanna et al.'s work on extreme contexts by describing the specifically grassroots military lens of an extreme context with these 5 circumstances. 1. An uncertainty about one's own reactions, including reaction to heightened stress and fatigue. 2. Uncertainty about an accurate reading of the situation at hand. 3. Uncertainty about enemy tactics, when, where, and how exactly they may strike. 4. Vulnerability of logistics. And 5. Gaps in coordination. So looking now at the progression of leadership development and these 3 leadership frameworks, we can see how the frameworks overlap to describe the evolution of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising leadership. Let's look more closely at the application of each framework. The social justice framework, characterized by developing heightened and critical awareness of oppression, education opportunities for learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions, action-oriented and transformative leadership, and relationship building, applies well to the pre-war leadership development, which was focused on developing organizational characteristics, recruiting membership, education, and common ideologies. As resistance movement leadership building begins to develop, with shifting identities, a revisioning of objectives, increased urgency, and conditions becoming far more dangerous with catastrophe imminent, the Leadership in Extreme Contexts framework, specifically as applied to naive organizations, takes over, characterized by massive physical, psychological, and material consequences, little capacity to prevent extreme events from occurring, and leaders promoting possibilistic thinking. And finally, during the immediate lead up to and through the weeks of active resistance, grassroots military leadership comes into play, with leaders as self-sacrificing, grounded visionaries with sincerity of purpose, a need to translate vision into practical, achievable objectives, a requirement for constant innovation, and leadership of a more heroic, inspirational nature rather than organizationally effective. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was undeniably a unique moment in time in history, but its leadership evolution reaches back well before the 28 days of fighting that marked the first organized resistance to the Nazis. Rooted in the social justice framework of the interwar year youth movements, leaders began to develop the characteristics and strategies necessary for organizing transformational societal change based on socialist, Zionist, and socio-political ideologies. But that social justice framework could only take these young activists so far, before the extreme context of imprisonment and deportation to death camps required a very different leadership focus. From utilizing the framework reflective action characteristics of social justice leadership described by Furman, A new leadership style was required, one that would be applicable in this new environment. Enter Hanna et al.'s framework for leading in extreme contexts, in which leadership is focused on situation, consequences, and organizational capacity, rather than reflection and relationship building. And ultimately, in the final stage of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the utilization of grassroots military leadership, as described by Ben-Guri and based on inspirational visionary leadership, was deployed to achieve the stated goal of the uprising, simply mounting a resistance and embedding that action in a national consciousness.